So I finally played Quantum Break, the logical conclusion of a road paved by Max Payne and Alan Wake, extending the former's manipulation of time and the latter's emulation of television suspense and structure. In gameplay, you possess not one ability, but 6. You're not manipulating a character within a world, you're affecting the world itself. Time doesn't just slow down, it stops completely, while registering everything you throw at it for a devastating effect. In storytelling, episodes aren't a cutesy synonym for levels, but full-blown live-action television installments with impressive talents from X-Men, Game of Thrones, and The Wire. And you're no longer a passenger in this roller coaster, but the technician in charge, with the television series being reactive to your choices through designated junctions in the story. All of this sounds ambitious, which it is, and compellingly complex, which it's not. Quantum Break may be a logical conclusion, but it's also a brick wall that crushes the developer's intentions and as a result, makes this game difficult. Not to play, beat, or resolve its timeline, but to understand how it makes you feel. I do know what I felt in specific instances. Intrigue, boredom, sadness, anger. But when the credits rolled, nothing solid. Just a collection of thoughts along the way that will hopefully make sense in retrospect. What's staggering about Quantum Break's core is how much of an accessory it is. Max Payne may be narrative-driven, but no one's going to argue that you spend more time watching than playing. The series has primary mechanisms that keep the player hooked. Quantum Break's intentionally a 50-50 split between story and gameplay with its inclusion of television episodes, but that 50% in the gameplay category doesn't feel accurate because gameplay entails participants. I'm not especially picky when it comes to interactivity. I've enjoyed walking simulators, telltale games, and indies without any combat whatsoever, but the lapses here aren't reminiscent of quiet time and greats such as Half-Life 2 or Metal Gear Solid 3. They're more akin to what I brought up in my most recent Call of Duty video, where levels have minimal input from the player. After reviewing the footage captured from my playthrough on the game's hardest difficulty, 20-minute stages can have as little as 6 minutes of combat. For the rest, you'll be walking or puzzle solving, but the walking is linear and accompanied by exposition dumps from the cast, and the puzzles are neatly disguised QuickTime events, almost always requiring you to hold Y as a temporary pathway is created. These are repeated in each act from the beginning all the way to the end. Not only does repetition grind this experience to a halt, there's a distinct lack of freedom, with there only being one solution, and whether you're using time stop or time rush, the result is the same. You've moved somewhere beyond the laws of physics. This makes the lack of combat apparent because that's the only place where you can take advantage of the game's mechanics. Excluding time powers for a moment, which is something the game does on occasion, this third-person action may be the weakest of Remedy's output. Weapons are hilariously inaccurate, low in magazine size, and not particularly powerful. It's clear from the rest of the controls that weapons handle as such in order to complement the gamepad. It's rather the opposite of Max Payne 3 that encourages precise shots, and admittedly frustrated on consoles. Here, movement is sluggish on a keyboard and aiming's uncharacteristically jaggy with a mouse, making the game feel like it's running at a lower frame rate than it actually is. But on a gamepad, Quantum Break's smooth as butter. Snapping on targets feels good, and when enemies are within close proximity, it generally feels great to unload your firearms into them. It's also refreshing to play a third-person console shooter that encourages you to keep moving. Enemies lob grenades if you take cover, and only one power is most effective when remaining still. It explains the automatic cover system, but when compared to the implementation of it in other games, it's not very impressive. There's no dedicated crouch button, and the radius your character ducks in is unreliable. It only led to my death a handful of times, but the inability to shoot at enemies in my sight without exposing the upper body makes the action clunky at times. There's many contradictions on the surface. Time powers can be used from cover in a manner that's similar to blind or hipfire, and not all buttons are used on the gamepad, making a dedicated crouch function possible without sacrificing any mechanics. Even earlier builds of the game allowed you to do some of these things, but there's always a reason for changes. I can confirm that with the powerful aim assistance, weapons are already proficient by themselves. While they lack satisfaction on hard mode, they get the job done, meaning it's easy to play Quantum Break as a by-the-numbers shooter and only use the powers as a get-out-of-jail-free card. So allowing the player to blindly fire over cover and run around with the hipfire accuracy of previous games would only reduce the time powers usage even more, and restrict them to either experimentation or exploitation, the latter of which can be seen in the 2014 Gamescom demo, where the player can repeatedly use Time Rush to one-punch melee his enemies. It's logical then that the game abandons certain controls to inspire using its most unique elements. The game is at its best when the powers are what bullet time was in Max Payne, an element to elevate the action in both spectacle and strategy. At some point, a game needs to decide not only what the player can do, but what they can't do. For instance, Spartans can realistically prone, scale walls, and roll, but in gameplay they can't because they'd run the risk of damaging the pace of combat or cluttering the controls. But depending on the design, certain in-actions will register with the player more. In the case of Quantum Break, it's in a no-win scenario. In the released product, your brain's instinct thinks you should be able to shoot someone in your line of sight without standing. In the unreleased product, instinct isn't tested at all because of the unbalanced combat. Level design varies from good to mediocre, with the good offering multiple approaches, environmental elements, and enemy variety. A common theme with the less interesting stages is an options list that greatly favors one strategy over everything else. An example is when Remedy repeatedly uses snipers to make you bypass with Time Rush. Due to inaccurate weapons, the only firearm that you can reliably hit them with is the carbine rifle they drop. Never mind that the carbine rifle is a DMR, and the weapon that they modeled it after is a bolt-action sniper rifle. Small but notable things like that are present throughout Quantum Break, in part because the presentation is so well produced. This game's fidelity is phenomenal, with gorgeous effects and epically detailed character models that avoid the uncomfortably numb facial capture of other big-budget games, which is what makes the fact your guns don't reload stand out, and that NPCs constantly rotate like robots. This is one of the dangers with increasing fidelity. It uplifts your triumphs and faults. When you produce these cinematic animations that fail to sync up to their environment, it's only less immersive than a player-controlled attack that can potentially look goofy. I can forgive some of these as unfortunate bugs that other people may never experience, and it's clearly not Remedy's intention, but there's plenty to fairly disagree with. The game's score never clicked during the experience. Quiet moments were unregistered ambience, and combat was a spasm of glitch effects. But listening to the music on its own, it's more engaging. Petri Alanco's familiarity with the medium shows in how well the soundtrack effectively captures the atmosphere and events of the game. And then I found the culprit.
So each time power has a music signature, and we try and adapt the music in real time depending on what the time scale of the game is.
As we've discussed, the game encourages the use of time powers, which means you're going to hear these effects overpowering the music regularly, making every encounter feel the same. One of the key successes for the music of Doom, Max Payne 3, or DMC is players get to hear the distinct tracks that make them want to jump into the action. And crap, I just used DMC as a positive example. Regardless of these errors, the presentation is superb, which means that if said problems were to be resolved, the gameplay would still be a humdrum exercise in patience. The AI is so unintelligent, no amount of difficulty modifiers can make up for it. Max Payne's goons were hardly Hannibal, and Alan Wake had you warring against a forest, but both of those games pitted their heroes as the underdog. Quantum Break is openly said to be a superhero origin story, and when its hero Jack is as powerful as he is, none of the enemies can get a scratch on him. I find a good way of testing the enemy's competence in a game is rushing to the middle and seeing how long it takes for them to put you down. Understandably, there's going to be some headroom that won't be apparent when in motion, but when you're already a superpowered character, having 15 seconds to not return any force and survive is just unacceptable and abolishes any tension the game could offer. Enemies marvel at your abilities, frequently screaming aloud, "How is he doing this?" but then charge you out in the open. It's counterintuitive, and this poor AI and lack of challenge really damages sections of the game which could have been remarkable. It's just hard to not ask questions while playing this game. Why do story clues have notifications? Why are there cutscenes which can easily be gameplay? Why do your powers get taken away routinely? Why do scenes restrict movement speed? In one sentence, everything you do in Quantum Break has to be done on its terms. I agree with Sam Lake's recent sentiment that there's nothing wrong with cutscenes and can sometimes be used more effectively than forcing a moment to be interactive. But the issues I brought up in Max Payne 2 have only gotten worse with time, and I'm afraid that Remedy's substance has been decaying with their emphasis on style. Not to say this game isn't without merit, at least outside of gameplay. The truth is, my affection for Remedy's output combined with a narrative about time travel, and Quantum Break was going to earn a playthrough from me regardless of its public reception. In storytelling, time travel is one of the most challenging narratives to build. It's a minefield of paradoxes, plot holes, and anomalies where even films that I enjoy fall under their weight to varying degrees. The reason Primer is held on such a high pedestal isn't because there aren't questions to raise in regards to its plot. It's because of all the time travel films released, its events and ambition are the most grounded. Characters aren't going back to kill Hitler, they're profiting from the stock market. They're not going back to stop someone's mother getting killed, but dealing with a deranged ex-boyfriend. and the mechanics of its time travel, using purpose-built machines that can only take the traveler as far back as its activation, is identifiable. I bring this up because Quantum Break's action and high stakes are reminiscent of big-budget spectacles like Terminator 2 or The Matrix, but its mechanics of time travel are more reminiscent of independent films. It's a unique combination that makes this game stand out in all time travel stories, not just video games. The most compelling aspect is a side effect of the subject matter and structure. From the first level, you're given a sense that you're stepping into something far beyond your grasp. While the protagonist has a history you haven't experienced, both you and the character are lost in that moment. And that desire to understand what's going on and putting the pieces together is what's likely to motivate you. And for all of the visual flair, story is the most detailed part of this game. Everywhere, there's emails and clues that build the world, vary the tone, and involve relevant characters. Even the humor, which sadly doesn't appear as it did in previous Remedy games, can be found in these collectibles. In fact, the plot is almost too detailed. There's so many narrative extras and levels that if you want to pursue the full story as I did, your percentage of combat per mission is going to be even lower. This wouldn't be a headache if the extras were brief, but they're not. I've read YouTube book posts with more concise writing. Max Payne had a few too many extras in its levels, but the majority never eclipsed a minute, let alone several, and they were narrated with comic panels which fit within the game's world. In Quantum Break, the extras aren't witnessed organically. Even artwork and drawings come with a button prompt, and reading obstructs half the screen in a generic font. I adore it when games encourage you to observe the world, immersing yourself, or just admiring the meticulous detail that multiple artists poured their souls into. This is something you couldn't do as much in the past because of the technical restrictions in texture detail. We've overcome that, yet Quantum Break doesn't take advantage of it, relying on techniques we used to do out of necessity. I'd suggest skipping these collectibles your first time through, but the problem is they're so overt, it's hard to ignore as they may reveal a piece of the story. And because they're so long, when nothing relevant is learned, it breeds resentment. It's honestly tempting to purchase the novelization to see if Quantum Break's abundance of text translates better to that art form. I'm reminded of the distinction between story and storytelling. Quantum Break's story is calculated, researched, and fascinating, but the storytelling is so discombobulated it's hard to not blame people for playing something else. It's in everything, from the disjointed song choice of every chapter to being forced into watching a show, or to the inconsistent dialogue that's a notable step back from Remedy's past.
You have 3 seconds till I pull.
Had better reflexes.
And you're a marksman for shit.
This is the first main title from the Finnish developer without Sam Lake being credited as a writer, and it shows. Characters are more cliché, the narration doesn't fit, and more importantly, this game takes itself very seriously. The end of time is repeated ad nauseum, there's no comedy relief, and moments that are supposed to give levity don't land as much as they need to. That goes for both the game and its television show, which is more akin to a web series. Its 4 episodes explore the enemy's perspective as advertised, but not in the way I think most were expecting. While it does involve key players, a large chunk of the story has to deal with side characters who barely relate to the big picture. This isn't just me being impatient and wanting to shoot Monarch goons. I read all the extras I could find, never skipped a cutscene, and only kept my attention to the screen when these episodes played. There's just a lot of filler. It's more difficult in games due to interactivity, but in scripted television, film, or novels, if none of the characters are affected emotionally or physically in a scene, then it shouldn't be in the story. Ergo, when a 5-minute car chase leads to a surrender with no deaths, injuries, or scratches on the character's car, it's a waste of time. The same conclusion could have taken place during the foot chase in Monarch HQ. It's evident that Microsoft's budget for these live-action scenes went to hiring the actors and not locations or sets. There's nothing wrong with having a low budget, see previously. But it's a problem when you aim for conflict that's out of reach. It's hard for a car chase to be exciting when it must abide to the constraints. There's only one crash and it's a dent on the front bumper so that the repair bill is cheap. The only road which could be closed for shooting this scene is clearly a two-way street because of the double lines and signs pointing in the opposite direction of the oncoming traffic, and bullets don't do any damage to cars. Not to mention, this is in contrast to a game whose engine routinely portrays catastrophic damage to its fictional city. The show is really at its best when using what Microsoft paid for. Aidan Gillen and Lance Reddick do a wonderful job at their material, and the show effectively creates sympathy for the people you're aiming to overthrow. It has a world that feels more sophisticated than Remedy's past entries, one that isn't black and white, with characters doing things that are wrong, but relatable. The side character Liam Burke is cliché at best and cringy at worst, but by the end of the show, I empathized with his desperation. Adding to your fight against his employers, And that's when the spoiler alert comes in. For those who are interested to experience the story for themselves, timestamps are available in the description, or you can skip to this part of the video. Spoilers will commence in 3, 2, 1. The show concludes with a character we've spent hours getting to know and understand his perspective and fear. That putting on the suit is a symbol of how he's been manipulated by our villain, the same villain we've also studied in the show and Junction Points. And all of this tragedy was amplified upon the realization that the man in the final frame is someone I'd have to kill. The boss is someone who I can't just write off as a maniacal evil, but a person with desires and wishes similar to mine. He's willing to fight to the death to protect his wife and unborn child. I felt genuinely moved, or I would have if the uninspired combat didn't allow me to kill him in 10 seconds on hard mode. The strength of the show that connects to this game is let down by the game itself. And while the show has a few standout moments, my favorite scene takes place in-engine, and only demonstrates that with technology this powerful and digital recreations of actors this expertly crafted, live action isn't necessary. While Shawn Ashmore, Aidan Gillen, and Lance Reddick are the most notable actors, Courtney Hope was the one who won me over. Beth Wilder's who I empathized the most with, sacrificing her entire life to a cause she put herself to, and spending years in isolation from the world and its inhabitants, unable to have friends, family, or fun due to her cause, which made her death impactful. The development of her character, understanding the motivation of her killer, and great cinematography made this the emotional high point in the story. The ending? Honestly, Act 5 might be the weakest of them all. In gameplay terms, this is where the lackluster level design I discussed is most prominent, and story-wise, this is when intriguing mysteries need to take a backseat to resolving the plot, though by the end, it's only partially settled. When developing a new IP, especially in the AAA space, it's important to make something that can be used for years to come. But it's possible to do that without a sequel bait that makes the ending unsatisfying. This has happened in 2 Remedy games so far, and it'd be a shame if it happened again. This developed into my longest so I finally played yet, which speaks to the amount there is to say about Quantum Break, and it can be broken down even further. But unlike past titles in Remedy's history, I don't feel the passion to do so. And that's what hurts this game the most. Remedy put in so much work and love into this experience, turning to physicists for its time travel mechanics, perfecting its presentation, and bringing on talent that understood and respected the medium and its material. But that passion doesn't translate to the player. It's a shame because I really respect Remedy, and I still do. They don't have the arrogance and facade that permeates an industry where profit is king. Unfortunately, I can't agree that Quantum Break is the studio's ultimate experience. It's a game worth playing if you're interested in seeing a AAA experiment, which doesn't happen very often. And science fiction fans will likely enjoy the story, as it's a very credible take on the genre, with far more research and talent than most, even outside its own art form. But for those outside of these parameters, complete Remedy's past before stepping into their future.
Raycevick clearly shows his incompetence for even tangentially enjoying Ninja Theory's disgusting digital filth.
Best and worst game of 2014. Best, Dragon Age Inquisition. Worst, Tactical Tactics. Do you know the way? You should have known that by the time I answer this question, this meme is dead. Are you ever going to make a video on the classic Fallout games? If I do, it won't be a years later piece. I've mentioned in the past my distaste for turn-based games, so I don't think the old Fallouts are going to be fairly assessed if I ever do a video on them. However, anything is possible. If all our parents sign off on it, can we have a sleepover at your place? Sure. Can a match box? Yes. Can a chicken scratch? Yes. Does tin foil? Yes. Do you love me? No. Who is another moderate-sized YouTuber I should bully? Mandalore. He's got too many friends. Because you circle jerk it so hard, what's your opinion on the new Black Mirror episodes? I still haven't watched the final episode, but overall my thoughts on the season is that I like it, but I think the show has started to become a bit of a victim of its own success. Because Black Mirror only used to get 3 episodes every season over a period of years before, it meant it was going to be a good episode. It meant that of all of the ideas that the team could experiment with, these were the ones that they felt told the best story. Now with Netflix's budget, it's starting to feel like they're just experimenting with things even if they don't necessarily work all that well. There's nothing inherently wrong with that, experimentation is good. But when episodes start to not feel like Black Mirror and just more genre pieces with a technological spin, then the show is becoming less interesting.
Everything about DMC Devil May Cry was abysmal, and now they've convinced this idiot to shill for their games? I'm not going to support a company that had the reboot of a franchise led by a man who got rid of Dante's white hair.